Ahoy again, everyone. It's me, Ron Gabaldon, an audiobook narrator that you know of. Welcome to part 6 of Hocus Pocus by Kurt Vonnegut. Boy, oh boy. By now, you've learned more about Athena College and Eugene Debs Hartke's firing by the Board of Regents of Tarkington College, how he gets the job over at the prison in Athena, and he shares with you an interesting story from a nudie magazine called Black Garter Belt, written by an unknown author, but I think we know who that author is. It's probably Kilgore Trout. He's just not mentioning it here, and it's called The Protocols of the Elders of Tralfamadore, an interesting book about how the elders of Tralfamadore, who are big, long strands, billions of light years long, meet to try to find a worthwhile specimen of life that is capable of transversing the cosmos. They do this by finding things that are virtually indestructible, and they need a crucible of incredible chaos for these tiny little microbes and things to survive in, and they decide to choose humans on Earth because we're so given to it. It makes so much sense that we would be the destructive force that tests a life form, a microbe or a bacteria or a virus for its durability, because we're so good at destroying things. You've also met Hiroshi Matsumoto, who is the warden of Athena Prison, which was purchased by the Japanese, and how much of America has been sold off to the Japanese and other foreign interests, Saudi Arabia, China, other foreign nations and entities that are buying up pieces of America, because the wealthy in this country are so short-sighted that a quick buck is really all they need. It gives you an idea about the type of wealth that exists here. If I'm editorializing too much, there you have it. Otherwise, enjoy here part 6 of Hocus Pocus by Kurt Vonnegut. Whee! Hocus Pocus by Kurt Vonnegut. Part 6, chapters 33 through 37, read by Ron Gabaldon. 33. It would work out well. When I moved Margaret and Mildred into our new home in the ghost town and pulled down the blinds, it was to them as though we had never left Scipio. There was a surprise present for me on our freshly sodded front lawn, a rowboat. The warden had found an old boat that had been lying in the weeds behind the ruins of the old Athena post office since before I was born, quite possibly. He had had some of his guards fiberglass the outside of it, making it watertight again after all these years. It looked a lot like the hide-covered Eskimo umiak that used to be in the rotunda outside the Dean of Women's office here, with the outlines of the ribs showing through the fiberglass. I know what happened to a lot of college property after the prison break, the griot, trademark, and so on, but I haven't a clue what became of that umiak. If it hadn't been on display in the rotunda, I and hundreds of Tarkington students and their parents would have gone all the way through life without ever seeing a genuine Eskimo umiak. I made love to Muriel Peck in that boat. I lay on the bottom, and she sat upright, holding my mother-in-law's fishing rod, pretending to be a perfect lady and all alone. That was my idea. What a good sport she was. I don't know what became of the man who claimed his name was John Donner, who wanted to teach shop at Athena 8 years before the prison break. I do know that the warden gave him very short shrift during his job interview, since the last things the prison needed inside its walls were chisels and screwdrivers and hacksaws and bandsaws and ball-peen hammers and so on. I had to wait for Donner outside the warden's office. He was my ticket back to civilization, to my home and family and copy of Black Garter Belt. I didn't watch Howdy Doody on the little screen. I interested myself in another person who was waiting to see the warden. His color coding alone would have told me that he was a convict, but he was also wearing leg irons and handcuffs, and was seated quietly on a bench facing mine outside the corridor, with a masked and rubber-gloved guard on either side of him. He was reading a cheap-looking booklet. Since he was literate, I thought he might be one of the people I was being hired to divert with knowledge. I was right. His name was Abdullah Akbar. With my encouragement, he would write several interesting short stories. One, I remember, was supposedly the autobiography of a talking deer in the national forest, who has a terrible time finding anything to eat in winter and gets tangled in barbed wire during the summer months, trying to get at the delicious food on farms. He is shot by a hunter. As he dies, he wonders why he was born in the first place. The final sentence of the story was the last thing the deer said on Earth. The hunter was close enough to hear it and was amazed. This was it. What the blankety-blank was that supposed to be all about? The 3 violent crimes that had gotten Abdullah into Athena were murders in drug wars. He himself would be shot dead with buckshot and slugs after the prison break, while carrying a flag of truce, by Whitey Van Arsdale, the mechanic, and Lyle Hooper, the fire chief. "Excuse me," I said to him, "but may I ask what you're reading?" He displayed the book's cover so I could read it for myself. The title was The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Cough. Abdullah was summoned to the warden's office, incidentally, because he was one of several persons, guards as well as convicts, who claimed to have seen a castle flying over the prison. The warden wanted to find out if some new hallucinatory drug had been smuggled in, or whether the whole place was finally going insane, or what on earth was happening. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was an anti-Semitic work first published in Russia about 100 years ago. It purported to be the minutes of a secret meeting of Jews from many countries who planned to cooperate internationally so as to cause wars and revolutions and financial busts and so on, which would leave them owning everything. Its title was parodied by the author of the story in Black Garter Belt, and its paranoia too. The great American inventor and industrialist Henry Ford thought it was a genuine document. He had it published in this country back when my father was a boy. Now, here was a black convict in irons who had the gift of literacy, who was taking it seriously. It would turn out that there were hundreds of copies circulating in the prison, printed in Libya and passed out by the ruling gang at Athena, the Black Brothers of Islam. That summer, I would start a literacy program in the prison, using people like Abdullah Akbar as proselytizers for reading and writing, going from cell to cell and offering lessons. Thanks to me, thousands of former illiterates would be able to read The Protocols of the Elders of Zion by the time of the prison break. I denounced that book, but couldn't keep it from circulating. Who was I to oppose the Black Brothers, who regularly exercised what the state would not, which was the death penalty? Abdullah Akbar rattled and clinked his fetters. "Is this any way to treat a veteran?" he said. He had been a Marine in Vietnam, so he never had to listen to one of my pep talks. I was strictly Army. I asked him if he had ever heard of an Army officer they called the Preacher, who was me, of course. I was curious as to how far my fame had spread. "No," he said. But, as I've said, there were other veterans there who had heard of me, and knew, among other things, that I had pitched a grenade into the mouth of a tunnel one time, and killed a woman, her mother, and her baby hiding from helicopter gunships, which had strafed her village right before we got there. Unforgettable. You know who was the ruling class at that time? Eugene Debs Hartke was the ruling class. Down with the ruling class! John Donner was unhappy on our trip back to Scipio from the prison. I had landed a job, and he hadn't. His son's bicycle had been stolen in the prison parking lot. The Mexicans have a favorite dish they call twice-fried beans. Thanks to me, although Donner never found out, that bicycle was now a twice-stolen bicycle. 1 week later, Donner and the boy dematerialized from this valley as mysteriously as they had materialized, leaving no forwarding address. Somebody or something must have been catching up with them. I pitied that boy, but if he is still alive, he, like me, is a grown-up now. Somebody was catching up with me, too, but ever so slowly. I am talking about my illegitimate son out in Dubuque, Iowa. He was only 15 then. He didn't even know my name yet. He had yet to do as much detective work to discover the name and location of his father as I have done to identify the murderer of Letitia Smiley, Tarkington College's 1922 Lilac Queen. I made the acquaintance of his mother while sitting alone at a bar in Manila, soon after the excrement hit the air conditioning in Vietnam. I didn't want to talk to anybody of either sex. I was fed up with the human race. I wanted nothing more than to be left strictly alone with my thoughts. Add those to my growing collection of famous last words. This reasonably pretty but shop-worn woman sat down on a stool next to mine. "Forgive my intrusion on your thoughts," she said, "but somebody told me you are the man they call the preacher?" She pointed out a master sergeant in a booth with 2 prostitutes who could not have been much over 15 years of age. "I don't know him," I said. "He didn't say he knew you," she said. "He's heard you speak. So have a lot of other soldiers I've talked to." "Somebody had to speak," I said, "or we couldn't have had a war." "Is that why they call you the preacher?" she said. "Who knows?" I said. "In a world as full of baloney as this one is?" I had been called that as far back as West Point because I never used profanity. During my first 2 years in Vietnam, when the only troops I gave pep talks to were those who served under me, I was called the preacher because it sounded sinister, as though I were a puritanical angel of death, which I was. "Would you rather I went away?" she said. "No," I said, "because I think there is every chance we could wind up in bed together tonight. You look intelligent, so you must be as blue as I am about our nation's great unvictory. I worry about you. I'd like to cheer you up." What the heck? It worked. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. 34. I was reasonably happy teaching at the prison. I raised the level of literacy by about 20%, with each newly literate person teaching yet another one. I wasn't always happy with what they chose to read afterward. One man told me that literacy made it a lot more fun for him to masturbate. I did not loaf. I liked to teach. I dared some of the more intelligent prisoners to prove to me that the world was round, to tell me the difference between noise and music, to tell me how physical traits were inherited, to tell me how to determine the height of a guard tower without climbing it, to tell me what was ridiculous about the Greek legend which said that a boy carried a calf around a barn every day, and pretty soon he was a man who could carry a bull around the barn every day, and so on. I showed them a chart a fundamentalist preacher from downtown Scipio had passed out to Tarkington students at the pavilion one afternoon. I asked them to examine it for examples of facts tailored to fit a thesis. Across the top of the chart named the leaders of warring nations during the finale rack during World War II. Then, under each name was the leader's birth date and how many years he lived and when he took office, and how many years he served, and then the total of all those numbers, which in each case turned out to be 3,888. Churchill, born 1874, age 70, took office 1940, years in office 4. Hitler, born 1889, age 55, took office 1933, years in office 11. Roosevelt, born 1882, age 62, took office 1933, years in office 11. Il Duce, born 1883, age 61, took office 1922, years in office 22. Stalin, born 1879, age 65, took office 1924, years in office 20. Tojo, born 1884, age 60, took office 1941, years in office 3. As I say, every column adds up to 3,888. Whoever invented that chart then pointed out that half that number was 1944, the year the war ended, and that the first letters of the names of the war's leaders spelled out the name of the supreme ruler of the universe. The dumber ones, like the dumber ones at Tarkington, used me as an ambulatory Guinness Book of World Records, asking me who the oldest person in the world was, the richest one, the woman who had had the most babies, and so on. By the time of the prison break, I think, 98% of the inmates at Athena knew that the greatest age ever attained by a human being whose birth date was well documented was about 121 years, and that this incomparable survivor, like the warden and the guards, had been Japanese. Actually, he had fallen 128 days short of reaching 121. His record was a natural foundation for all sorts of jokes at Athena, since so many of the inmates were serving life sentences, or even 2 or 3 life sentences, either superimposed or laid end to end. They knew that the richest man in the world was also Japanese, and that, about a century before the college and the prison were founded across the lake from each other, a woman in Russia was giving birth to the last of her 69 children. The Russian woman who had more babies than anyone gave birth to 16 pairs of twins, 7 sets of triplets, and 4 sets of quadruplets. They all survived, which is more than you can say for the Donner Party. Hiroshi Matsumoto was the only member of the prison staff with a college education. He did not socialize with the others, and he took his off-duty meals alone, and hiked alone, and fished alone, and sailed alone. Neither did he avail himself of the Japanese clubs in Rochester and Buffalo, or of the lavish rest and recuperation facilities maintained in Manhattan by the Japanese Army of Occupation in business suits. He had made so much money for his corporation in Louisville and then Athena, and was so brilliant in his understanding of American business psychology, that I am sure he could have asked for and gotten an executive job in the Home Office. He may have known more about American black people than anybody else in Japan, thanks to Athena, and more of the businesses his corporation was buying here were dependent on black labor, or at least the goodwill of black neighborhoods. Again, thanks to Athena, he probably knew more than any other Japanese about the largest industry by far in this country, which was the procurement and distribution of chemicals that, when introduced into the bloodstream one way or another, gave anybody who could afford them undeserved feelings of purpose and accomplishment. Only one of these chemicals was legal, of course, and was the basis of the fortune of the family that gave Tarkington its band uniforms, and the water tower atop Musket Mountain, and an endowed chair in business law, and I don't know what all else. That mind-bender was alcohol. In the 8 years we lived next door to him in the ghost town down by the lake, he never once indicated that he longed to be back in his homeland. The closest he came to doing that was when he told me one night that the ruins of the locks at the head of the lake, with huge timbers and boulders tumbled this way and that, might have been the creation of a great Japanese gardener. In the Japanese Army of Occupation, he was a high-ranking officer, the civilian peer of a brigadier maybe, or even a major general. But he reminded me of several old master sergeants I had known in Vietnam. They would say the worst things about the Army and the war and the Vietnamese than anybody. But I would go away for a couple of years and then come back, and they were all still there, crabbing away. They wouldn't leave until the Vietnamese either killed them or kicked them out of there. How they hated home! They were more afraid of home than of the enemy. Hiroshi Matsumoto called this valley a hellhole and the anus of the universe, but he didn't leave it until he was kicked out of here. I wonder if the Mohiga Valley hadn't become the only home he ever knew after the bombing of Hiroshima. He lives in retirement now in his reconstructed native city, having lost both feet to frostbite after the prison break. It is possible that he is thinking now what I have thought so often. What is this place, and who are these people, and what am I doing here? The last time I saw him was on the night of the prison break. He had been awakened by the racket of the Jamaicans' assault on the prison. We both came running out onto the street in front of our houses, barefoot and in our nightclothes, although the temperature must have been minus 10 degrees centigrade. The name of our main street in the ghost town was Clinton Street, the name of the main street in Scipio. Can you imagine that? Two communities so close geographically, and yet in olden times so separate socially and economically that, with all the street names they might have chosen, they both named their main street Clinton Street. The warden tried to reach the prison on a cordless phone. He got no answer. His 3 house servants were looking out at us from windows upstairs. They were convicts over 70 years old, serving life sentences without hope of parole, long forgotten by the outside world, and coked to the gills on Thorazine. My mother-in-law came out on our porch. She called to me. "Tell him about the fish I caught! Tell him about that fish I caught!" The warden said to me that a boiler up at the prison must have blown, or maybe the crematorium. It sounded to me like military weaponry, whose voices he had never heard. He hadn't even heard the atomic bomb go off. He had only felt the hot whoosh afterward. And then all the lights on our side of the lake went off. And then we heard the strains of the Star-Spangled Banner floating down from the blacked-out penitentiary. There was no way that the warden and I, even with massive doses of LSD, could have imagined what was going on up there. We were faulted afterward for not having alerted Scipio. As far as that goes, Scipio, hearing the explosion and the Star-Spangled Banner and all the rest of it across the frozen lake, might have been expected to take some defensive action. But it did not. Survivors over there I talked to afterward said they had just pulled the covers over their heads and gone to sleep again. What could be more human? What was happening up there, as I've already said, was a stunningly successful attack on the prison by Jamaicans wearing National Guard uniforms and waving American flags. They had a public address system mounted atop an armored personnel carrier and were playing the national anthem. Most of them probably weren't even American citizens. But what Japanese farm boy serving a 6-month tour of duty on a dark continent would be crazy enough to open fire on seeming natives in full battle dress who were waving flags and playing their hellish music? No such boy existed. Not that night. If the Japanese had started shooting, they would have lost their lives like the defenders of the Alamo. And for what? For Sony? Hiroshi Matsumoto threw on some clothes. He drove up the hill in his Isuzu Jeep. He was fired upon by the Jamaicans. He bailed out of his Isuzu. He ran into the national forest. He got lost in the pitch blackness. He was wearing sandals and no socks. It took him 2 days to find his way back out of the forest, which was almost as dark in the daytime as it was at night. Yes, and gangrene was feasting on his frostbitten feet. I myself stayed down by the lake. I sent Mildred and Margaret back to bed. I heard what must have been the Jamaicans' shots at the Isuzu. Those were their parting shots. After that came silence. My brain came up with this scenario. An attempted escape had been thwarted, possibly with some loss of life. The explosion at the beginning had been a bomb made by the convicts from nail parings or playing cards or who knows what. They could make bombs and alcohol out of anything, usually in a toilet. I misread the silence as good news. I dreaded a continuation of the shooting, which would have meant to me that the Japanese farm boys had developed a taste for killing with guns, which can suddenly become, for the uninitiated, easy and fun. I envisioned convicts in or out of their cells becoming ducks in a shooting gallery. I imagined, now that there was silence, that order had been restored, and that an English-speaking Japanese was notifying the Scipio Police Department and the state police and the county sheriff about the squashed escape attempt, and probably asking for doctors and ambulances. Whereas the Japanese had been bamboozled and overwhelmed so quickly that their telephone lines were cut, and their radio was smashed before they could get in touch with anyone. There was a full moon that night, but its rays could not reach the floor of the national forest. The Japanese were not hurt. The Jamaicans disarmed them and sent them up the moonlit road to the head of the lake. They told them not to stop running until they got all the way back to Tokyo. Most of them had never even seen Tokyo. And they did not arrive at the head of the lake hollering bloody murder and flagging down passing cars. They hid up there. And if the United States was against them, who could be for them? I had no gun. If a few convicts had broken out and were still at large, I thought, and they came down into our little ghost town, they would know me and think well of me. I would give them whatever they wanted: food, money, bandages, clothes, the Mercedes. No matter what I gave them, I thought, since they were color-coded, they would never escape from this valley, from this lily-white cul-de-sac. There was nothing but white people all the way to Rochester's city limits sign. I went to my rowboat, which I had turned upside down for the winter time. I sat down astride its slick and glassy bow, which was aimed at the old barge terminal of Scipio. They still had lights over in Scipio, which was a nice boost for my complacency. There wasn't any excitement over there, despite the noise at the prison. The lights in several houses went off. None went on. Only one car was moving. It was going slowly down Clinton Street. It stopped and turned off its lights in the parking lot behind the Black Cat Cafe. The little light atop the water tower on the summit of Musket Mountain winked off and on, off and on. It became a sort of mantra for me, so that I sank even deeper into thoughtless meditation, as though scuba diving in lukewarm bouillon. Off and on that little light winked, off and on, off and on. How long did it give me rapture from so far away? 3 minutes? 10 minutes? Hard to say. I was brought back to full wakefulness by a strange transformation in the appearance of the frozen lake to the north of me. It had come alive somehow, but noiselessly. And then I realized that I was watching hundreds of men engaged in a sort of project which I myself had planned and led many times in Vietnam, which was a surprise attack. It was I who broke the silence. A name tore itself from my lips before I could stop it. The name? Muriel! 35. Muriel Peck wasn't a barmaid anymore. She was a full professor of English at Tarkington, making good use of her Swarthmore education. She was asleep at the time of the surprise attack, all alone in faculty housing, a vine-covered cottage at the top of Clinton Street. Like me, she had sent her 2 kids to expensive boarding schools. I asked her one time if she ever thought of marrying again. She said, "Didn't you notice? I married you." She wouldn't have gotten a job at Tarkington if the trustees hadn't fired me. An English teacher named Dwight Casey hated the head of his department so much that he asked for my old job just to get away from him. So that created a vacancy for Muriel. If they hadn't fired me, she probably would have left this valley and would be alive today. If they hadn't fired me, I would probably be lying where she is, next to the stable, in the shadow of Musket Mountain, when the sun goes down. Dwight Casey is still alive, I think. His wife came into a great deal of money soon after he replaced me. He quit at the end of the academic year and moved to the south of France. His wife's family was big in the mafia. She could have taught, but didn't. She had a master's degree in political science from Rutgers. All he had was a BS in hotel management from Cornell. The Battle of Scipio lasted 5 days. It lasted 2 days longer than the Battle of Gettysburg, at which Elias Tarkington was shot by a Confederate soldier who mistook him for Abraham Lincoln. On the night of the prison break, I was as helpless a voyeur, once the attack had begun, as Robert E. Lee at Gettysburg, or Napoleon Bonaparte at Waterloo. There was one shot fired by someone in Scipio. I will never know who did it. It was some night owl with a loaded gun in easy reach. Whoever did it must have been killed soon afterward. Otherwise, he would have bragged about what he had done so early in the game. Those were good soldiers who crossed the ice. Several of them had been in Vietnam, and so, like me, had had lessons in military science on full scholarships from the government. Others had had plenty of experience with shooting and being shot at, often from early childhood on, and so found a single shot unremarkable. They saved their ammunition until they could see clearly what they were shooting at. When those seasoned troops went ashore, that was when they commenced firing. They were stingy with their bullets. There would be a bang and then silence for several minutes. And then, when another target appeared, maybe a bleary-eyed householder coming out his front door or peering out a window, with or without a weapon, there would be another bang or 2 or 3 bangs, and then silence again. The escaped convicts, or freedom fighters, as they would soon call themselves, had to assume, after all, that many, if not most households had firearms, and that their owners had long daydreamed of using them with deadly effect should precisely what was happening happen. The freedom fighters had no choice. I would have done the same thing had I been in their situation. Bang! Somebody else would jerk backward and downward, like a professional actor on a TV show. The biggest flurry of shots came from what I guessed from afar to be the parking lot in back of the Black Cat Cafe, where the prostitutes parked their vans. The men who visited the vans that late at night had handguns with them, just in case. Better safe than sorry. And then I could tell from the sporadic firing that the freedom fighters had begun to climb the hill to the college, which was brightly lit all night, every night, to discourage anybody who might be tempted to do harm up there. From my point of view across the lake, Tarkington might have been mistaken for an emerald-studded Oz, or City of God, or Camelot. You can bet I did not go back to sleep that night. I listened and listened for sirens, for helicopters, for the rumble of armored vehicles, for proofs that the forces of law and order would soon put a stop to the violence in the valley with even greater violence. At dawn, the valley was as quiet as ever, and the red light on top of the water tower on the summit of Musket Mountain, as though nothing remarkable had happened over there, winked off and on. Off and on. I went next door to the warden's house. I woke up his 3 servants. They had gone back to bed after the warden charged up the hill in his Isuzu. These were old men, sentenced to life in prison without hope of parole. Back when I was a little boy in Midland City, I hadn't even learned to read and write probably when they ruined some lives, or were accused of doing so, and were forced to lead lives not worth living as a consequence. That would certainly teach them a lesson. At least they hadn't been put into that great invention by a dentist, the electric chair. Where there is life, there is hope, so says John Gay in the Atheist's Bible. What a starry-eyed optimist! These 3 old geezers hadn't had a visitor or a phone call or a letter for decades. Under the circumstances, they had no vivid ideas of what they would like to do next, so they were glad to take orders from almost anybody. Other people's ideas of what to do next were like brain transplants. All of a sudden, they were full of pep. So I had them drink a lot of black coffee. Since I was worried about what might have happened to the warden, they acted worried too. Otherwise, they wouldn't have. I did not tell them that there had been a mass prison break and that Scipio had been overrun by criminals. Such information would have been useless to them. Would have been like more TV. They were supposed to stay where they had been put, no matter what in the real world might be going on. Those 3 were what psychologists call other-directed. I took them over to my house and ordered them to keep the wood fire in the fireplace going, and to feed Margaret and Mildred when they got hungry. There were plenty of canned goods. I didn't have to worry about the perishables in the refrigerator, since the air in the kitchen was already so cold. The stove itself ran on bottled propane, and there was a month's supply of that science fiction miracle. Imagine that. Bottled energy. Margaret and Mildred, thank goodness, felt neutral about the warden's zombies, the same way they felt about me. They didn't like them, but they didn't dislike them either. So everything was falling into place. They would still have a life support system even if I went away for several days or got wounded or killed. I didn't expect to get wounded or killed except by accident. All the combatants in Scipio would regard me as unthreatening. The whites because of my color coding, and the blacks because they knew and liked me. The issues were clear. They were black and white. All the yellow people had run away. I had hoped to get away from the house while Margaret and Mildred were fast asleep. But as I passed my boat on my way to the ice, an upstairs window flew open. There my poor old wife was, a scrawny, addled hag. She sensed that something important was happening, I think. Otherwise, she wouldn't have exposed herself to the cold and daylight. Her voice, moreover, which had been rasping and bawdy for years, was liquid and sweet, just as it had been on our honeymoon. And she called me by name. That was another thing she hadn't done for a long, long time. This was disorienting. "Gene?" she said. So I stopped. "Yes, Margaret?" I said. "Where are you going, Gene?" she said. "I'm going for a walk, Margaret, to get some fresh air," I said. "You're going to see some woman, aren't you?" she said. "No, Margaret, word of honor, I'm not," I said. "That's all right. I understand," she said. It was so pathetic. I was so overwhelmed by the pathos, by the beautiful voice I hadn't heard for so long, by the young Margaret inside the witch. I cried out in all sincerity, "Oh, Margaret, I love you! I love you!" Those were the last words she would ever hear me say, for I would never come back. She made no reply. She shut the window and pulled down the opaque black roller blind. I have not seen her since. After that side of the lake was recaptured by the 82nd Airborne, she and her mother were put in a steel box on the back of one of the prison vans and delivered to the insane asylum in Batavia. They will be fine as long as they have each other. They might be fine even if they didn't have each other. Who knows until somebody or something performs that particular experiment. I have not been on that side of the lake since that morning, and may never go there again, as close as it is. So I will probably never find out what became of my old footlocker, the coffin containing the soldier I used to be, and my very rare copy of Black Garter Belt. I crossed the lake that morning, as it happens, never to return, to deliver a particular message to the escaped convicts, with the idea of saving lives and property. I knew that the students were on vacation. That left nothing but social nobodies, in which category I surely include the college faculty, members of the servant class. To me, this low-grade social mix was ominous. In Vietnam, and then in later showbiz attacks on Tripoli and Panama City and so on, it had been perfectly ordinary for our Air Force to blow communities of nobodies, no matter whose side they were on, to kingdom come. It seemed likely to me, should the government decide to bomb Scipio, that it would be sensible to bomb the prison too. And everything would be taken care of, and no argument. Next problem? How many Americans knew or cared anyway where or what the Mohiga Valley was, or Laos, or Cambodia, or Tripoli? Thanks to our great educational system and TV, half of them couldn't even find their own country on a map of the world. 3/4 of them couldn't put the cap back on a bottle of whiskey without crossing the threads. As expected, I was treated by Scipio's conquerors as a harmless old fool with wisdom. The criminals called me the preacher or the professor, just as they had on the other side. I saw that many of them had tied ribbons around their upper arms as a sort of uniform. So when I came across a man who wasn't wearing a ribbon, I asked him jokingly, "Where's your uniform, soldier?" "Preacher," he said, referring to his skin, "I was born in a uniform." Alton Darwin had set himself up in Tex Johnson's office in Somoza Hall as president of a new nation. He had been drinking. I do not mean to present any of these escapees as rational or capable of redemption. They did not care if they lived or died. Alton Darwin was glad to see me. Then again, he was glad about everything. I had to advise him nonetheless that he could expect to be bombed unless he and the rest of them got out of town right away. I said their best chance to survive was to go back to the prison and fly white flags everywhere. If they did that right away, they might claim that they had nothing to do with all the killings here. The number of people the escapees killed in Scipio, incidentally, was 5 less than the number I myself had killed single-handedly in the war in Vietnam. So, the Battle of Scipio was nothing but a tempest in a teapot, an expression the atheist Bible tells us is proverbial. I told Alton Darwin that if he and his people didn't want to be bombed and didn't want to return to the prison, they should take whatever food they could find and disperse to the north or west. I told him one thing he already knew, that the floor of the national forest to the south and east was so dark and lifeless that anyone going in there would probably starve to death or go mad before he found his way back out of there. I told him another thing he already knew, that there would soon be all these white people to the west and north, having the times of their lives hunting escaped convicts instead of deer. My second point, in fact, was something the convicts had taught me. They all believed that the white people who insisted that it was their constitutional right to keep military weapons in their homes all looked forward to the day when they could shoot Americans who didn't have what they had, who didn't look like their friends and relatives, in a sort of open-air shooting gallery we used to call in Vietnam a free fire zone. You could shoot anything that moved for the good of a greater society, which was always someplace far away, like paradise. Alton Darwin heard me out, and then he told me that he thought I was right, that the prison probably would be bombed. But he guaranteed that Scipio would not be bombed, and that it would not be attacked on the ground either, that the government would have to keep its distance and respect the demands he meant to put to it. "What makes you think that?" I said. "We have captured a TV celebrity," he said. "They won't let anything happen to him. Too many people will be watching." "Who?" I said. And he said, "Jason Wilder." That was the first I heard that they had taken hostage not only Wilder, but the whole board of trustees of Tarkington College. I now realize, too, that Alton Darwin would not have known that Wilder was a TV celebrity if old tapes of Wilder's talk show hadn't been run again and again at the prison across the lake. Poor people of any race on the outside never would have watched his show for long, since its basic message was that it was poor people who were making the lives of the rest of us so frightening. 36. "Star Wars," said Alton Darwin. He was alluding to Ronald Reagan's dream of having scientists build an invisible dome over this country, with electronics and lasers and so on, which no enemy plane or projectile could ever penetrate. Darwin believed that the social standing of his hostages was an invisible dome over Scipio. I think he was right, although I have not been able to discover how seriously the government considered bombing the whole valley back to the Stone Age. Years ago, I might have found out through the Freedom of Information Act, but the Supreme Court closed that peephole. Darwin and his troops knew the lives of the hostages were valued highly by the government. They didn't know why, and I am not sure that I do either. I think that the number of people with money and power had shrunk to the point where it felt like a family. For all the escaped convicts knew about them, they might as well have been aardvarks or some other improbable animal they had never seen before. Darwin regretted that I, too, was going to have to stay in Scipio. He couldn't let me go, he said, because I knew too much about his defenses. There were none as far as I could see, but he sounded as though there were trenches and tank traps and minefields all around us. Even more hallucinatory was his vision of the future. He was going to restore this valley and its former economic vitality. It would become an all-black utopia. All whites would be resettled elsewhere. He was going to put glass back into the windows of the factories and make their roofs weather-tight again. He would get the money to do this and so many other wonderful things by selling the precious hardwoods of the national forest to the Japanese. That much of his dream is actually coming true now. The national forest is now being logged by Mexican laborers using Japanese tools under the direction of Swedes. The proceeds are expected to pay half of day before yesterday's interest on the national debt. That last is a joke of mine. I have no idea if any money for the forest will go toward the national debt, which, the last I heard, was greater than the value of all property in the Western Hemisphere, thanks to compound interest. Alton Darwin looked me up and down, and then he said, with typical sociopathic impulsiveness, "Professor, I can't let you go because I need you." "What for?" I said. I was scared to death that he was going to make me a general. "To help with the plans," he said. "For what?" I said. "For the glorious future," he said. He told me to go to this library and write out detailed plans for making this valley into the envy of the world. So that, in fact, is what I mainly did during most of the Battle of Scipio. It was too dangerous to go outside anyway, with all the bullets flying around. My best utopian invention for the ideal Black Republic was Freedom Fighter beer. They would get the old brewery going again, supposedly, and make beer pretty much like any other beer, except that it would be called Freedom Fighter beer. If I say so myself, that is a magical name for beer. I envisioned a time when, all over the world, the bored and downtrodden and weary would be bucking themselves up at least a little bit with Freedom Fighter beer. Beer, of course, is actually a depressant, but poor people will never stop hoping otherwise. Alton Darwin was dead before I could complete my long-range plan. His dying words, as I've said, were, "See the nigger fly the airplane." But I showed it to the hostages. "What is this supposed to mean?" said Jason Wilder. "I want you to see what they've had me doing," I said. "You keep talking as though I could turn you loose if I wanted. I'm as much a prisoner as you are." He studied the prospectus, and then he said, "They actually expect to get away with this?" "No," I said. "They know this is their Alamo." He arched his famous eyebrows in clownish disbelief. He has always looked to me a lot like the incomparable comedian Stanley Laurel. "It would never have occurred to me to compare the rabid chimpanzees who hold us in durance vile with Davy Crockett and James Bowie and Tex Johnson's great-great-grandfather," he said. "I was just talking about hopeless situations," I said. "I certainly hope so," he said. I might have added, but didn't, that the martyrs at the Alamo had died for the right to own black slaves. They didn't want to be a part of Mexico anymore because it was against the law in that country to own slaves of any kind. I don't think Wilder knew that. Not many people in this country do. I certainly never heard that at the academy. I wouldn't have known that slavery was what the Alamo was all about if Professor Stern, the unicyclist, hadn't told me so. No wonder there were so few black tourists at the Alamo. Units of the 82nd Airborne, fresh from the South Bronx, had by then retaken the other side of the lake and herded the prisoners back inside the walls. A big problem over there was that almost every toilet in the prison had been smashed. Who knows why? What was to be done with the huge quantities of excrement produced hour after hour, day after day, by all these burdens on society? We still had plenty of toilets on this side of the lake, which is why this place was made an auxiliary prison almost immediately. Time was of the essence, as the lawyers say. Imagine the same sort of thing happening on a huge rocket ship bound for Betelgeuse. 37. On the last afternoon of the siege, National Guard troops relieved the airborne troops across the lake. That night, undetected, the paratroops took up positions behind Musket Mountain. 2 hours before the next dawn, they came quietly around either side of the mountain, captured the stable, freed the hostages, and then took possession of all of Scipio. They had to kill only one person, who was the guard dozing outside the stable. They strangled him with a standard piece of equipment. I had used one just like it in Vietnam. It was a meter of piano wire with a wooden handle at either end. So, that was that. The defenders were out of ammunition. There were hardly any defenders left anyway, maybe 10. Again, I don't believe there would have been such a delicate microsurgery by the best ground troops available if it hadn't been for the social prominence of the trustees. They were helicoptered to Rochester, where they were shown on TV. They thanked God and the Army. They said they had never lost hope. They said they were tired but happy, and just wanted to get a hot bath and then sleep in a nice clean bed. All National Guardsmen who had been south of the Meadowdale Cinema Complex during the siege got combat infantry badges. They were so pleased. The paratroops already had theirs. When they dressed up for the victory parade, they wore campaign ribbons from Costa Rica and Bimini and El Paso and on. And from the Battle of the South Bronx, of course. That battle had to keep on going without their help. Several nobodies tried to get onto a helicopter with the trustees. There was room, but the only people allowed aboard were on a list which had come all the way from the White House. I saw the list. Tex and Zuzu Johnson were the only locals named. I watched the helicopters take off, the happy ending. I was up in the belfry, checking on the damage. I hadn't dared to go up there earlier. Somebody might have taken a shot at me. And it could have been a beautiful shot. And as the helicopters became specks to the north, I was startled to hear a woman speak. She was right behind me. She was small and was shod in white sneakers and had come up ever so quietly. I wasn't expecting company. She said, "I wondered what it was like up here. Sure is a mess, but the view is nice, if you like water and soldiers." She sounded tired. We all did. I turned to look at her. She was black. I don't mean she was so-called black. Her skin was very dark. She may not have had any white blood whatsoever. If she had been a man at Athena, skin that color would have put her in the lowest social caste. She was so small and looked so young, I mistook her for a Tarkington student. Maybe the dyslexic daughter of some overthrown Caribbean or African dictator who had absquatulated to the USA with his starving nation's treasury. Wrong again. If the college griot, trademark, had still been working, I am sure it would have guessed what she was, and what she was doing there. She had lived outside all the statistics on which griot, trademark, based its spookily canny guesses. When griot, trademark, was stumped by somebody who had given statistical expectations as wide a berth as she had, it just sat there and hummed. A little red light came on. Her name was Helen Dole. She was 26. She was unmarried. She was born in South Korea and had grown up in what was then West Berlin. She held a doctorate in physics from the University of Berlin. Her father had been a master sergeant in the Quartermaster Corps of the Regular Army, serving in Korea and then in our Army of Occupation in Berlin. When her father retired after 30 years to a nice enough little house in a nice enough little neighborhood in Cincinnati, and she saw the horrible squalor and hopelessness into which most black people were born there, she went back to what had become just plain Berlin and earned her doctorate. She was as badly treated by many people over there as she would have been over here. But at least she didn't have to think every day about some nearby black ghetto where life expectancy was worse than that in what was said to be the poorest country on the planet, which was Bangladesh. This Dr. Helen Dole had come to Scipio only the day before the prison break to be interviewed by Tex and the trustees for, of all things, my old job teaching physics. She had seen the opening advertised in the New York Times. She had talked to Tex on the telephone before she came. She wanted to make sure he knew she was black. Tex said that was fine, no problem. He said that the fact that she was both female and black, and held a doctorate besides, was absolutely beautiful. If she had landed the job and signed a contract before Tarkington ceased to be, that would have made her the last of a long succession of Tarkington physics teachers, which included me. But Dr. Dole had blown up at the Board of Trustees instead. They asked her to promise that she would never, whether in class or on social occasions, discuss politics or history or economics or sociology with students. She was to leave those subjects to the college's experts in those fields. "I just plain blew up," she said to me. "All they asked of me," she said, "was that I not be a human being." "I hope you gave it to them good," I said. "I did," she said. "I called them a bunch of European planters." Lowell Chung's mother was no longer on the board, so all the faces Dr. Dole saw were indeed of European ancestry. She asserted that Europeans like them were robbers with guns who went all over the world stealing other people's land, which they then called their plantations, and they made the people they robbed their slaves. She was taking a long view of history, of course. Tarkington's trustees certainly hadn't roamed the world on ships, armed to the teeth, and looking for lightly defended real estate. Her point was that they were heirs to the property of such robbers, and to their mode of thinking, even if they had been born poor and had only recently dismantled an essential industry, or cleaned out a savings bank, or earned big commissions by facilitating the sale of beloved American institutions or landmarks to foreigners. She told the trustees, who had surely vacationed in the Caribbean, about the Carib Indian chief who was about to be burned at the stake by the Spaniards. His crime was his failure to see the beauty of his people's becoming slaves in their own country. This chief was offered a cross to kiss before a professional soldier or maybe a priest set fire to the kindling and logs piled up above his kneecaps. He asked why he should kiss it, and he was told that the kiss would get him into paradise, where he would meet God and so on. He asked if there were more people like the Spaniards up there. He was told that of course there were. In that case, he said, he would leave the cross unkissed. He said he didn't want to go to yet another place where people were so cruel. She told them about Indonesian women who threw their jewelry to Dutch sailors coming ashore with firearms, in the hopes that they would be satisfied by such easily won wealth and go away again. But the Dutch wanted their land and labor too. And they got them, which they called a plantation. I heard about that from Damon Stern. "Now," she said to them, "you are selling this plantation because the soil is exhausted, and the natives are getting sicker and hungrier every day, begging for food and medicine and shelter, all of which are very expensive. The water mains are breaking. The bridges are falling down. So you're taking all your money and getting out of here." One trustee, she didn't know which, except that it wasn't Wilder, said that he intended to spend the rest of his life in the United States. "Even if you stay," she said, "you and your money and your soul are getting out of here." So she and I, working independently, had noticed the same thing, that even our natives, if they had reached the top or been born at the top, regarded Americans as foreigners. That seems to have been true, too, of people at the top in what used to be the Soviet Union. To them, their own ordinary people weren't the kinds of people they understood and liked very much. "What did Jason Wilder say to that?" I asked her. "On TV, he was always so quick to snatch any idea tossed his way, cover it with spit, so to speak, and throw it back with a crazy spin which made it uncatchable." "He just let it lie there for a while," she said. I could see how he might have been flummoxed by this little black woman who spoke many more languages than he did, who knew 1,000 times more science than he did, and at least as much history and literature and music and art. He had never had anybody like that on his talk show. He may never have had to debate with a person whose destiny Griot, trademark, would have described as unpredictable. He said at last, "I am an American, not a European." And she said to him, "Then why don't you act like one?"